So about 15 months ago, I got an email out of the blue from a former law school classmate of mine asking me if I'd be interested in writing a Supreme Court brief, an amicus brief, on behalf of college basketball coaches defending affirmative action. You don't get that email every single day, needless to say. So, a little background. I really wasn't that surprised to get the email from him. The case in question is called Fisher versus Texas. 3 years earlier, he had, as a constitutional law professor, he had written on behalf of the college basketball coaches the first time that the court heard the case. It had gone up, they'd sent it back down to the Fifth Circuit for more fact-finding, and now 3 years later is back up. At the time, I said he was a constitutional law professor. 3 years later, he had been now named dean of his law school, and as such, he was precluded from taking the case. Just one note here on definitions. So affirmative action, we're going to say for the sake of this talk, is the program by which a school or other business and so forth tries to meet its diversity goals. Currently, universities are allowed to use affirmative action as a plus factor. In other words, a plus factor between two applications that are relatively close. Just a little bit of background there. So why would I be interested? Well, this is me, a thinner, younger, more athletic, less gray hair version of me. This is in the summer of 1988, and I apologize for the resolution here. This is screen capture of a VCR that has been converted to a CD. The tape is 28 years old, been sitting in my mom's basement for most of that time. So I'm 20, closest to the camera. This is taking place on Georgetown's campus, actually. Summer of 1988, I'm in Washington, D.C. working and playing in something called the Kenner League, which still exists, very competitive college league. And it attracts guys from up and down the East Coast, maybe as far south as North Carolina, all the way up to perhaps Philadelphia, who come in for games on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So I'm closest. You can see two teammates. One of them is Sam Jefferson, who played at Georgetown in this era. He's got his hand up. He's on the low block on the other side. I found him to be a very good player. He was going to his junior year, and I thought he was going to be Georgetown's starting center. Unfortunately for Sam, Georgetown had recruited Alonzo Mourning and Dikembe Mutombo. Both guys, all-time great. They're going to show up on campus 6 weeks after this game is being played. Both guys are all-time great Georgetown guys, NBA All-Stars, and ultimately Hall of Famers. So Sam's career is not going to go the way he hoped right now. At the top of the screen, you can see Dennis Scott, who is a player at this point at Georgia Tech. He's just finished his freshman year. He's about to shoot. He had a pretty good freshman year, but he's about to make the leap. Within 2 years, he's going to be the ACC Player of the Year, and he's a number 4 draft pick in the NBA draft in 1990 after leading his team to a Final Four. But what you also see is this is the world, if you want to play at a high level, this is the world you need to play at. These guys are very athletic, very tall, very competitive, and very black. It is a world where you need to go find if you want to play against the best players. And so that's what I did. And that informed, I don't want to make too much of it, it is what it is, but it's also informed how I think about affirmative action and how I think about taking on the case, which I did. So as I mentioned, the college basketball coaches were our clients. There were three major organizations, the men's organization, the women's organization, and the minority coaches organization, which was almost 10,000 individual coaches represented there. But then almost 280 individual coaches signed the brief themselves, putting their own name on the line and in the court. So John Thompson, for those of you who remember Georgetown basketball in the early 80s, mid 80s, not surprising he's a signatory, but he was. Case Washington, who's been instrumental in building the women's game at Penn State, she was on the brief. Gino Auriemma, Jim Boeheim, both Hall of Famers, Gino obviously at UConn, and Jamie Dixon in the background there, also on the brief. And this is Mike Krzyzewski, perhaps one of the most surprising, if you know anything. Mike Krzyzewski is described by John Feinstein as a Rockford Republican. He grew up in a Catholic family in Chicago, military academy grad. He's on the brief as well. Why? Why are all these coaches caring about affirmative action? Not for themselves and not for their players. Their players are actually not affected at all. Their players, if they're good enough and they're going to get offered a scholarship and they can hit certain grades and scores, test scores, they are going to be admitted, period. But what they don't want is the only African Americans on campus to be the kids on their basketball team. And that's how do we know that? Because it happened earlier. In California in 1996, Proposition 209 passed. It took a few years to be implemented and to be fully in place. But when it did, the UCLA class, a freshman class that was admitted subsequent to that, 5,000 kids, only 96 African Americans, and many of them were recruited athletes. So we wrote the brief, we filed it in November, and then in December, went down to hear the oral argument. This is actually right afterwards. You can see the press scrum around Abby Fisher, who was the plaintiff in the case. And we waited and waited and waited. Justice Scalia died in February, and we still waited. And finally, in June, the court, by a 4-3 margin, one vote, Anthony Kennedy, we'll talk about in a second, ruled in favor of Texas. Affirmative action saved, go forward. And then November 8th happened. So obviously, we've just gone through a very divisive campaign, and that's one of the most disappointing parts about it. President-elect Trump, the words don't roll off the tongue quite yet for me. President-elect Trump ran a campaign of us against Mexicans, us against Muslims, us against the other. And there's certainly no indication by the Supreme Court picks that he foretold in July, the list that he said, many of those people will be arguably more conservative than Scalia himself, which is a seat that's open right now. We know that that seat's going to go next year, most likely to a very conservative member of the court. So where does that say? The court is hanging in the balance. It's 5-4. As I said, Justice Kennedy, who, interestingly enough, the last time the court heard affirmative action in 2003, he actually dissented. So he actually changed his mind, and he's been very back and forth on affirmative action. He wrote the opinion this time in the Texas case in favor of it, but he's been back and forth. One other important thing you need to know about the 2003, the last time the court heard the case. At that moment, Justice O'Connor wrote the lead opinion. And what she said at the time is, in 25 years, are we still going to need, or why will we need affirmative action? Will it be brought to an end? And in fact, the court has picked up on this already. At the oral argument in December, Chief Justice Roberts asked the University of Texas lawyer, he said, well, are we going to meet our deadline? Will we meet this 25-year deadline set in 2003, meaning which we're halfway through, essentially. So I mentioned Justice Kennedy, who's been on both sides of the issue. Justice Ginsburg, who is a staunch pro-vote, is 83 years old. Justice Breyer is also a staunch pro-vote, 75 years old. Those are the facts, sort of on the ground as you look forward. In fairness, affirmative action is a program that dates back to the Kennedy administration. And that's something I think we have to keep in mind. If you're thinking about defending it, how do you practice? It is a program that's been around for a long time. And we still talk in the same terms, African Americans, Latinos, and so forth, same categories. So maybe one of the things we have to think about if we're going to defend affirmative action going forward is what other categories, in other words, should we be considering class and socioeconomic classes, if you will, as part of affirmative action. And the other question is, are we measuring diversity correctly? In other words, are we saying the right things as far as finding those people? There was a study that, the question also is really, do we know how to judge diversity? We say all the time, diversity makes our programs better, makes our classes better, so forth. How do we know that? Well, there's been nascent studies on this. For instance, there was a study of business school students that I saw. But what was interesting is when they went down inside the numbers, they said, well, self-confidence, if you have a diverse group and you go from low self-confidence to high self-confidence, that group way outperforms any other group, non-diverse, et cetera. But if you have a diverse group with empathy, high empathy, low empathy, it's almost no difference. And in fact, it might tail down depending on the margin of error. So we need to know more about diversity and how it works. We also need, that's at the micro level. At the macro level, we also need to understand it. So last year, McKinsey helped us a little bit. They published a study early last year, worldwide, multiple companies, multiple countries. And they took each individual country separately, and they graded each company on diversity scale within quartiles. So Brazil's banks were measured against Brazil's banks, not against Canadian banks or European banks or the likes. And so they went back and said, well, how does that affect financial performance? And so what they found is if you're in the top quartile in gender diversity versus your peers, you are 15% more likely to outperform them on average, 1-5. If you are ethnically diverse, you're 35% more likely to outperform. Now, a couple caveats. Those numbers are sort of, they don't add up. In other words, if you're ethnically diverse, you're probably also gender diverse. So it's not you don't stack one on top of the other. The other thing is important is correlation is not causation, which McKinsey says and which we agree. But the numbers are the numbers. So if you were arguing against diversity, against affirmative action, you have to explain these numbers. Either McKinsey's methodology is wrong, possible, probably not right, or there has to be some other explanation for why diversity is generating better financial results. But if you're on the other side, if you're defending diversity and you have these numbers, in the absence of anything else, better financial performance, the diverse company is the one that's trying to make America great again. Thank you.